Welcome back to the Hate Meditation podcast. Glad to have you. We thought we'd do a mid-year catch-up, just to sort of round up on the releases that we've been checking out the first half of the year. And I'm joined, as ever, by the one and only Joseph April. How are you doing?
Hi, Shelley. Hi, everybody here.
How are things? Have you been watching any of the World Cup at all?
Well, at a concert I was at last night, there was a Colombian band, so there were a number of people watching the Colombia-Portugal game. So it's actually one of the first times in an outing I've seen the World Cup going on. I greatly appreciate it, but one of my ugly American qualities is just not being that much of a fan of European/world football.
Well, thank you for referring to it as football and not soccer.
I knew that would be triggering.
Well, so I'm not actually a massive football fan, but I do normally watch England when there's a international tournament on. One of the things I have loved about the tournament is every now and then they'll flash up on the screen at the stadium some like NFL player who's watching the match. 9 times out of 10, the audience have no idea who they are, so there's no kind of like cheering or anything. It's just, I don't know who that is, just some random guy. But yeah.
No, it's been interesting with it happening in the States. Like, there's been a lot of press coverage about Europeans in particular, but everyone internationally coming over here and being culture shocked in oddly positive ways about American life, especially the food. So that's been interesting. Yeah, I'll probably watch the final. Like, whoever, is up for the final game, I'm sure I'll give that a watch.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think, well, some of them are culture shocked by the cost of certain things as well, but that's to be expected with a major tournament like that. But yeah, on the food thing, I remember a few years ago when Jason came over to the UK, he was a bit culture shocked by the food, but probably in the opposite way. In that we have a reputation for terrible food, and I think we very well and truly lived up to it while he was here. So,
I mean, admittedly, the only British food I've ever had was in London, so I imagine it's quite different compared to the rest of the country.
Well, yeah, it depends what you have. Like, yeah, a big city like that, it is a lot better than it was like 20 years ago, but also it's just. Yeah, I remember, like, I've been to sort of New York and Boston and stuff, and it's sort of a similar situation where you kind of have pick of whatever cuisine you really want. But I was trying to feed Mason like proper traditional, like fish and chips, have a sausage roll, have a Cornish pasty, and a pie.
Now, see, I enjoy that. Like, I actually really do like that kind of food.
Yeah, I think it's just with Jason living, well, he has access to a lot of Mexican food, so he's used to his spices, and I think, just the lack of any of that. So it's like, yeah, okay, well, we'll have to go out for a curry or something because we do at least have a lot of Indians around here. But anyway, cool. So on to the albums. So Joseph and I, we've decided to select 4 each from the first half of 2026, from a range of different genres, just because there's only 2 of us, so we've picked 4 this time. And yeah, we're just gonna go through them, chat about them. We haven't necessarily heard of each other's picks in most cases, so it might be stuff that we're relatively new to. And then if we get time at the end, we might discuss some of the bigger releases this year. So skip to about 5 minutes to the end if you don't want to hear about a load of new music you haven't heard of. Well, I imagine you've heard of this first pick of mine, though, because it did make a bit of a splash when it came out. Cryptic Shift. One of the reasons I picked them is just because they're from my hometown of Leeds. And I've been following them for quite some time. I remember, I need to think about when this is now. Maybe 2018, 2019, Suffocation came through on tour, and Cryptic Shift was supporting, and I think that was the first time I came across them. And at that point, they were sort of still developing from a progressive thrash band into more of a kind of, well, progressive death metal band. Had a lot of kind of Atheist going on and Pestilence and things like that. And then it took them a couple of years to release their debut, and it was kind of hampered by COVID at the time. Basically, the release pretty much landed bang in the middle of the pandemic, so they weren't able to kind of back it up with any touring, but they did sort of get out of the gate pretty quickly after that when gigs opened up. And then they also, most of the members are in another project called Slime Lord, which is more on the Death Doom side, and they released an album in 2023, which is why Cryptic Shift has kind of taken so long to put a follow-up out. And I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the Slime Lord album title, and it was 2024, apologies. But yeah, they started out more on the Death Doom side, and then they became a little bit more progressive and weird, but still very different direction to what Cryptic Shift ended up being. And then, yeah, this year came the second Cryptic Shift album. And I guess in the first instance, I do have to apologize to Joseph, because two of the albums I've picked are approaching an hour and a half in length, and this is one of them. So
Yep.
asked a lot of you to go for quite a lot of music with this one, but yeah, this one's nearly an hour and 20. Overspace and Supertime, it's called. And yeah, it took me a while to get my head around this one, because where Cryptic Shift came from, they were much tighter, more compact. So they had a lot of like proggy elements to them, but it was more typical of progressive death metal. You could even see elements of like more direct stuff like Morbid Angel in there. And then on their debut album, it opens with like a half hour, I don't want to call it a track because it doesn't really work like a track. It's more like a suite. And that's kind of what they've expanded on with Overspace and Supertime. Most of the tracks are well over 10 minutes in length. Some of them are, again, one of them's half an hour long. The last one is 20 minutes long. But they're not really continuous pieces of music. They are more like suites, I guess. And they'll sort of develop one idea, kind of drop it, move into something else, kind of drop it. And then some ideas do develop into sort of what could be construed as a full track. But again, it sort of still forms part of a much bigger structure. And they'll work through different like genres through that as well. There's a hell of a lot of like jazz, a la Alan Holdsworth, and sort of classic 70s progressive elements in there, as well as thrash. I can hear punk in there. Lots of death metal, obviously. And yeah, even some sort of classic heavy metal stuff. So all of the usual suspects come up in terms of the influences, from Death and Pestilence and Atheist to things like Watchtower, and then some more like sort of direct thrash, Dead Brain Cells maybe, stuff on the bouncier side, like even Anthrax riffs here and there. So yeah, it has that kind of retro feel, but it's all thrown into a blender. And I think some people found this frustrating because it doesn't behave like a death metal album, because it is kind of like a series of parts. But I feel like a little bit, once you kind of get your head around what they're doing or how they're behaving, it does kind of fall into place a little bit, and it becomes a little bit less frustrating. And I'm sorry to mention the name so early in the podcast, but it's they have a distinctive way of delivering that is just different to Blood Incantation. I feel like Blood Incantation was still shooting for writing one continuous piece of music on their last album, and it never quite came off for me. Whereas Cryptic Shift, I think they just don't even bother. They sort of write these sort of little segments. Some of them are 2 or 3 minutes. As I said, some of them stretch to 6 or 7 minutes. But they're much more explicit in kind of just doing it like an episodic kind of sequence, I guess. So I imagine it has been quite a divisive album, although some people have come out of the gate sort of praising it to the rooftops. I was on the fence initially. I took a while to kind of digest it, but I feel like it is definitely one of the more interesting metal albums I've heard in the last few years. It's not quite what I was expecting, which is why I'm kind of hesitating. I was expecting them to maybe tighten up their songwriting a little bit from the first album, but on here, if anything, it's got much looser. But in a way, I kind of admire the fact that they kind of lent into that a little bit. So yeah, Joseph, had you come across these guys before?
Yeah, I think around the time of their first album, I had heard them, but they hadn't really. I mean, pretty much all of your picks were stuff that was relatively new to me. Just this was probably the most previously familiar. But yeah, did you have a further question about that, or?
Well, what did you think of it?
Yeah, what did I think of it? All right, let me give a couple caveats. I mean, you mentioned they're a local band to you, and I kind of figured that was the case. And I can't begrudge anyone, even if I find negative things with something, I can't begrudge anyone who goes, I either know these guys or I've seen them multiple times before they remotely got big. And there's a certain attachment you have to music like that is purely organic, and you can't, I think, communicate that to other people who haven't had those experiences. So it is what it is with that. Like, there might be a band that someone would be like, oh, that's absolute shit. And it's like, yeah, but I knew them back during the demo days. So, I have my affinity for it. I don't think there's anything in Cryptic Shifts that is offensive to me at all. Like, at any given moment in the music, I can relate to it to other bands. Certainly a lot of the well-known sci-fi leaning proggy death and thrash. I mean, certainly if you enjoy bands like Nocturnus, Voivod, Atheist, Cynic, there's a lot here that I think someone would enjoy. It really does, for me, come down to the way they've structured it. Like, the worst things that people can say about prog, and as someone who tends to hate prog at its most excessive, this feels very excessive. The time is a bit bloated. The song lengths, I think on average, it's about 15 and a half minutes per song. You got one that's 29 minutes. It at times feels sort of like everything in the kitchen sink. I know people have said that was a band like Sigh or something. It's just, this doesn't have the sort of every instrument in a high school band room plugged in. It's more just everything in the kitchen sink that's available in the typical metal musical pantheon. At the same time, it's not like I think there's anything lazy. It's certainly not like these guys clearly know what they're doing in terms of being able to play competently, professionally, tightly. And again, in moments, as someone who loves a lot of their influences, I can enjoy at that time. But it's sort of like, I would put it in the category of like reading Ulysses. It's just a bit too much. Like, it's an impressive work, but just goes beyond the restrictions and disciplines I tend to like to see in music. And certainly compared to Blood Incantation, I looked it up, and there is like a big difference in terms of album length and song length. Like, I think the last Blood Incantation album is about half as long as this album. So, and I think the older I get, the more I realize I really do think kind of the 70s vinyl format, in terms of having a certain amount of songs fit to side A, a certain amount of songs fit to side B. I really do think there was some magic to that. So bands that push the limits of that, well beyond, and even like in this case, push the limits of what a traditional CD would even be able to manage. I think it's just a bit too much.
Yeah, I mean, I meant to say, in the introduction that when I said apologies for recommending two very long albums, it is generally one of my bugbears, and I think it's one of the great sort of underrated things about digital media in general is that it has allowed people to just dispense with their editing process and just go nuts with the amount of content that it put out. And this goes for bands that I generally enjoy most of their output, like, I don't know, The Ruins of Beverast or Midnight Odyssey are always ones that come to mind, and that some of their albums are longer than feature films. And here is no exception. So I definitely agree with that. And to some extent, I'm kind of happy to just sit back and let them noodle and kind of go full on into the wankiness of it, for want of a better word. Whereas sometimes I do have little patience for that. And that is just because there is enough kind of just weirdness going on here and stuff that I generally haven't heard before. But I think what you're pointing to, and accepting that, yeah, there is that kind of local bias that I have, but is the fact that these guys are fans. They're a few years younger than me, not that much younger, but that still counts as I can't remember what the one, like, I think they're like, maybe they're in their 20s, I think. But they are clearly fans of this music to a great extent, and they've absorbed a lot of it, and they've studied how to play it, and they've wanted to expand on that to a great extent. And also with that, and where I would agree that they do get a little bit overindulgent, is they really go into detail with the songs and the concepts behind it. Like, they've almost written a novel basically to back up the concept of this, and this is the sequel to the debut album, which is part of the same concept. So it's all part of this kind of swirling lore that they've written, and sometimes that can work, but in this instance it's something that I never have too much interest in. That I like to know the general themes of an album, but I prefer just to keep it vague. And I feel like some bands, and Cryptic Shift aren't like the exception here, there's lots of younger bands that do this. They do go all in with their concepts to the point where it does start to affect the music to the extent that they overwrite the music. Not like overwrite it, I mean like write too much and too detailed, to the point where it does kind of start to detract from the listening experience to some extent. And I think that's probably where some people are not connecting with this album as much as they could. But it's just, it's just one of those times where I'm kind of willing to kind of just like, absorb myself in the experience to some extent. And there's a few other bands that I do tend to do that with, and just give them more of the time of day, because I'm familiar with them to that extent. But anything else to say on this one before we move on?
Again, like I think I can easily imagine people I know thoroughly enjoying this, and I wouldn't, but just because it's not an album I'm probably going to pull up often, I don't think that detracts. I think it's just certain personalities will be drawn to this, in the sense of like, if you've never felt busy as a critique of anything, you'll enjoy this because it's a very busy album. If you're someone who likes stuff that allows room to breathe, this probably isn't the album for you.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best way to put it. Cool. Okay, so moving on to your first pick, which isn't even really a metal album, but it's a band called Poison Ruin and an album called Hymns from the Hills. Do you want to chat about this one?
Yep. Sort of similar. I mean, a number of these bands are relatively new, which is interesting since I've often mentioned before that I feel like I do linger on to a lot of older stuff. But I think these guys got started really around the time of the pandemic. It was sort of a bedroom project by the main man in the band, Kennedy. And basically the concept was sort of a punk-oi, at times death rock band, but in a medieval setting. So they said punks with chainmail, essentially. And I think I heard, the first time I ever heard this was the Metal Massacre 15 compilation that came up during the pandemic. And I really enjoyed that track. But actually, as the band went on and released sort of a compilation of demos as an album, and then their first real album, I kind of fell off from them, feeling like a lot of the music started to sound just a little too much the same. But their last EP, I don't know, I'm not going to pronounce this right, but Conferry, kind of pulled me back in. And then when this came out, I just immediately got grabbed in the way that certain albums do. I'm sure everyone has those experiences where just from the drop of the needle, as it were, you're pulled in and you love every second of it. It definitely has metal at its edges and probably some metal influences, but I would not call this a metal album. By and large, the metal elements, if you wanted to be mathematical about it, probably are limited to about 10 to 20% of what's going on here. But I think a good point of reference, Kennedy was interviewed in a Discogs piece to name a couple of influential albums. And in particular, he mentioned mostly the debuts, but a couple others. But he mentioned essentially the Wipers, the UK band Sacrilege, Killing Joke, early Satyricon, and the Ramones. And I think if you put all that together, you do kind of get what Poison Ruin's doing. And in particular, this album, I think, really highlights the variety of those influences as well as others I'd mention in the same vein as like The Damned, Amoebics, even Motorhead to a certain extent. It was noted that this album really was a focus on production, on actually not having it sound necessarily like a bedroom project, but really actually sounding like an album shaped and formed in the studio. And with that, there's a lot of bells and whistles added in. And a lot of that I really enjoy, in that I think the early material at times could feel very Spartan. So some of these extra flourishes really kind of add character to the songs, rather than them kind of just feeling like bones underneath that chainmail, as it were. This album in particular, it really calls me back to The Damned, especially with something like Machine Gun Etiquette, which I've often called like the Sgt. Pepper's of punk. Every song feels different. Every song stands out on its own. Those extra flourishes, like I mentioned, like for example, on the title track, Hymn from the Hills, has harmonica used on it, which immediately I can always think of that song as the harmonica song. But as well with it, the riffing and the guitar work, at every moment I never feel like the next song sounds like the last song that played, which is something I really truly enjoy. And I don't know whether I came to punk later with that, but even early days in metal, like I always felt like something like Metallica with Master of Puppets, or certain other bands, certainly Sabbath. I always appreciated bands who it seemed like wrote songs that stood out on their own, that it didn't just feel like the album had to be all together. The other thing that's interesting, I think, to note with this band is certainly it had a very political aspect to them, very much kind of taking sort of the class struggle idea of a lot of modern punk, but putting it into a medieval setting. So sort of a peasants' revolt against the landed gentry kind of aesthetic. And as someone who isn't necessarily on the left of politics. Sometimes I could find that a bit grating when it comes up. Like there's a certain black metal band who have used themes like that, and I don't particularly appreciate it. I think on this album, it's not gone, but it's rewritten, and I think as Kennedy mentioned in an interview, he had a much more poetic focus this time on those themes rather than a diatribe type of focus. And I think in a lot of ways, when you write very political music, being poetic about it tends to make it more appealing to more people. It feels more like art and an allowance of interpretation, rather than putting yourself in a very specific time and place or various ideological barriers, precisely. It's one thing to talk about citing Lenin and Mao, for example, than to be talking about Robin Hood. I think far more people can appreciate that. And I wrote down as a note here, when you think of the politics here, it's the same kind of politics that would make Lemmy and Johnny Cash nod their heads along in agreement. So I don't think the political nature of this music should feel alienating to all of that many people, other than maybe Elon Musk.
Yeah, I guess just on that point specifically, Amoebics are always my go-to example there, especially by the time they put out Arise, because the like, still very much political, and that was their background in anarcho-punk, but the album itself feels much more like earthy and I don't say vague, but like spiritual. I think
the mystical,
it's sort of connected to the land a lot more and much more. Feels much more kind of permanent to the statements that are being made. And you've kind of name dropped all of the names I was going to drop when I was listening to this album, in terms of influences. But I think just to again speak to your point on the fact that every track sounds different, it's not that they've taken all those influences, blended them. It was when I was listening to it like, this track sounds like Motorhead, this track sounds like Killing Joke, this track sounds like Amoebics.
There's a lot of variety in the songs. It doesn't feel like every song fits a particular style. Like they definitely shift with their stuff, which I feel like is, when I mentioned The Damned and Machine Gun Etiquette, I feel like that's very much there. Like there's a song that has vaudevillian aspects, there's a song that's almost proto-gothic, then there's a song that's straight up 77 punk, and then one with like a dark psychedelia. Like they have all these influences, but it doesn't feel like all their influences need to be in every single song.
Yes, that's it. And when I was listening, so it's kind of packaged in quite a you contextualize it a bit there with the medieval theme, but for me, when I was listening to it because I prefer to go in without context initially and then kind of look into the band. But when I was doing my first sort of dry run, I was like, this feels like, for want of a better word, a punk album in the most general sense of the term, but kind of packaged like a black metal album, in that there's an intro that's very kind of spiritual and mystical. There's a few interludes throughout that lean into the folky aspects, and I guess that's kind of where the early Satyricon influence comes in to some extent. Definite sort of neo-folk backdrop going on there, but the tracks themselves, once they get going, you'll be kind of being treated to a Ramones-esque bit here and a more of a psychobilly bit there. I mean, but as you also mentioned, the fact that it's a studio album, it's very well produced. It doesn't feel incongruous at any point. It is all kind of tied together by quite a cinematic production, and it's got quite a kind of atmospheric feel to it throughout, even when it's doing some very basic kind of grounded punk music and stuff. It still fits in with this quite ethereal kind of arcane feel to it. It's an interesting album, and I can see why it's did you say it came out on Relapse? Sorry.
Yes.
Yeah. That aside, I could see why it's kind of landed with more of a metal audience as well, because it speaks to a lot of the same themes. And every now and then there's those albums that do come up where it's got that sort of crossover appeal, where it's a bit of a hybrid of lots of different things. I mean, we we talked about the Messer album from last year, which did a similar thing, but that seemed to clearly resonate with a metal audience, even though there were plenty of non-metal elements there as well. And I think this one's kind of doing a similar thing. Very different music, obviously, but like doing a similar thing in terms of taking a lot of influences from post-punk, goth and metal and folk and stuff, and churning them all up, but coming up with something that will probably appeal to a lot of the metal crowd as well. So yeah, it was an interesting album, definitely.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you. Yeah, I'm glad it didn't fall on deaf ears for you.
I probably shouldn't say this on record, but yeah, the moment I pressed play, I was like, yeah, we probably shouldn't have invited Jason on.
Well, I mean,
yeah, he'd a lot of my all over it, but
yeah, a lot of my tendency to go to the boundary lines in metal just probably doesn't appeal to him very, very much.
Well, yeah, it made me think like, oh yeah, I should have known to not expect like 4 extreme metal albums from Joseph. There will be a bit of variety in here, and it is good because I was looking at my kind of the stuff I've covered this year and trying to think, well, I can't just go 3, 4 black metal albums. I do want to pick a little bit of variety, but even then I did struggle a little bit. I think I've just struggled with albums that stood out this year in general. But I like the fact that, yeah, there's a little bit of variety in here to discuss something else. And yeah, the fact that, yeah, these guys just, they seem to have, a bit like Cryptic shift in a lot of ways. This seems to be like, this is their second album. They're coming out on a bigger label. They're trying to sort of expand the project a bit. It's reaching more ears. And yeah, it's interesting. I was looking just before we started recording as well. I was looking at some of the coverage, and yeah, it's getting quite a lot of attention from different places, big and small. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if it won't come up on Metal Archives because it's not on Metal Archives, and as we know, they're the arbiter of what's metal. But so I doubt it'll come up on their album of the year list when they do their end of year vote. But yeah, it's definitely going to resonate with that crowd, I think, and definitely like metalheads, not just because a lot of metalheads do like goth and punk and stuff, but some more than others. But I think leaning into that neo folk and mystical atmosphere does give them a little bit more appeal. I think fans of, sort of Wardruna and that kind of Nordic folk style might find something in this that they find appealing as well. If nothing else, just the packaging of it, the way it's kind of presented is definitely reminiscent of that.
And one band, and note for me, one band I didn't really mention, but like especially with this new album, really kind of reminded me of is New Model Army.
Oh yeah.
And I think especially how like that band went on to influence Sepultura, especially around the time of like Chaos AD and them getting more experimental. I think there's some definitely fellow currents running there.
Oh yeah, definitely. Another local band to me, although admittedly well before my time. But yeah, they're another band where explicitly political a lot of the time, but it's the politics that can appeal to left and right. I know that for a fact because I know a lot of fans locally that were sort of followed with them in the scene and stuff. And yeah, they're all from across different areas of the political spectrum. But New Model Army, they definitely sort of embody that kind of folk wisdom, I guess you could call it in some ways, where it's just very kind of expressive, resonant, and catchy in a kind of folky way that it's sort of meant to be literally accessible, not in terms of sort of pop accessibility, but it's kind of meant to kind of stick with you and be memorable and so on. So yeah, definitely got that from them as well.
All right. Okay. Do you want to move on to your next pick?
Yes, another big boy.
Yes.
And challenge for I've never pronounced this out loud, so apologies to any Greeks out there. Caedes Cruenta, I believe they're called. And this is their latest album, and I believe it translates to Oath of the Elect in English. So these guys, yeah, they've been going for quite a long time, since the early 2000s. I came across them with the album before this in 2021, of Ritual Necrophagia and Mysterious Ghoul Cults, which is just a fantastic title for an album. And based on that and the cover, which is very much cartoonish, you would expect it to be a kind of gore metal band or some kind of silly grindcore band or something. But no, what presents you is very, very classic Greek black metal. And I put this up there at the time as like one of my albums of the year. I think it made the top 5 because unlike a lot of modern metal that goes for that Greek sound or draws from that Greek sound, I often find that it tends to be a little bit overwrought. And that goes for like the modern efforts from those classic bands like later Varathron, Rotting Christ. Sometimes it's left me a little bit cold because it's a little bit too polished, a little bit too busy and kind of trying to be dramatic in a lot of ways. And sometimes it just kind of leads to sensory overload for me. Whereas this was very much more austere. The riffs were much more stripped back, but still very kind of dynamic and creative. The keyboards were much more atmospheric and kind of lent it that very kind of ancient feeling. So yeah, that was an absolutely fantastic album. This, the long-awaited follow-up, is... I mean, I guess I responded in a similar way as I did the Cryptic Shift to this, because it's an hour and a half in length. It's not available anywhere online except for YouTube. And you kind of have to sit with it because it's a 5-course meal. And it is basically like sitting down to watch a film. It starts with a very dramatic orchestral introduction. It has several kind of phases as it goes throughout, and it draws on several different kind of schools of metal, shall we say. It's less explicitly Greek than the previous album. There's still like all of the things that you would expect from the Greek style, like the more mid-paced momentum to the blast beats, the melodic kind of heavy metal derived riffing, lots of kind of flair with the vocals and theatre and so on. But they're more explicit in drawing from kind of old school thrash, but on the sort of darker side. Let's call it first wave black metal, for want of a better word. There's a clear death metal influence as well. They threw in a Morbid Angel cover towards the end of the album, Angel of Disease, which fits really well into the album, but it's definitely a phase of the album that is leaning more into that old school death metal vibe, that sort of when death metal was still a little bit kind of evil and gothic in a more explicit way. And then it's peppered with plenty of kind of interludes. I hesitate to call them interludes because that makes them sound incidental. They're pieces of music in their own right. There's long sort of keyboard passages. And yeah, I mean, I wouldn't call it dungeon synth necessarily, but it's sort of I kind of like how Septic Flesh on their first 3 albums used to go lean really hard into their kind of interludes and stuff and kind of make them fully composed, fleshed out pieces of music in their own right. So it's all there. I think just go back to my point on kind of longer albums and what I was saying about Cryptic Shift as well, is the reason this one didn't turn me off so much is they've done the groundwork. They're a band that I've just decided when I heard their previous album that I'm just going to pay attention to what they do because they're a very interesting band. And I feel like because it's on YouTube, I could just glance down and see the length of it without even like meaning to, basically. So I was like, oh, this is going to be fucking long. But that kind of meant that I could just steel myself for the experience and kind of just let it wash over me. And I think, again, I wasn't treating it like an album in the traditional sense. I was treating it more like a band that's kind of earned the right to conduct a survey of metal to some extent and find different ways of expressing themselves through these different sounds, through these different traditions, like all of the kind of influences that they're drawing on, not specific bands necessarily, but like specific eras within metal. You've got the sort of, the very early dark thrash stuff drawing from the 80s, and then some later kind of early death metal stuff. And then again, even later, the more like flamboyant elements of Greek black metal, and then a bit of the ambient side as well, and then sort of crushing it together, seeing what works. But it comes with a very kind of epic flair to it. But it isn't. It's too long to kind of take in a totality. It doesn't flow like just an album pick an album that sound works as like one continuous piece. Like, I don't know, in the Nightside Eclipse, where you just know there's a sequence of events across the album that you can kind of conceptualize in your mind. This one is almost too big to do that with. You kind of have to take it in stages, I suppose. I mean, it might come to me when I've sat with it for a few years, but obviously it only came out a few months ago. So at the moment, I'm still kind of digesting it in episodes, I guess. And it's another one where I wouldn't say I'm on the fence about it. I think they've pulled it off, but I still need to be a little bit convinced as to whether they could have trimmed this down, whether the length was warranted, and so on. But in and of itself, there's still like a wealth of stuff to unpack. And all of it is sort of compelling, and some of it is very high quality. So yeah, first of all, Joseph, sorry for making you work through all of this in the space of about a week. But yeah, what did you think of it?
Oh, given that it was just the two of us, it wasn't too bad. It's funny because the Greek scene, I kind of have an odd relationship with, in that I really do enjoy early Rotting Christ. And I have a smattering of knowledge of other bands like Verathon and a couple of others, but like compared to some friends of mine, I don't really have a deep knowledge of the Greek scene. Like, more often than not, Rotting Christ is probably the only band that I continually return to. Verathon, somewhat. So when hearing this, that's kind of my main reference point. And certainly I heard at times a lot of Rotting Christ in particular, the early stuff, Thy Mighty Contract and Non Severum and some of the early stuff, which is interesting since I just saw Rotting Christ do a live set of all that. And I enjoy that. I really do enjoy that kind of metal. It's obviously it's less busy compared to, let's say, Cryptic Shift, but its epic length even longer than the Cryptic Shift album, because it is essentially a double album, is a lot. And I've probably given it 1.5 listens to now, where, as you mentioned, I've like pulled it up on YouTube and maybe have been able to get 20 or 30 minutes in, and then had to stop and then go back in for another 20 or 30 minutes and then stop. So it's kind of hard to kind of have a physical sense of the album, and it also being on YouTube kind of does that in general. Yeah, I think I'd have a very different perception of this band if, like you, I had been introduced with their previous album. I think maybe having an affinity for this band already would make me, and certainly as I know, like when bands put out very large albums, when it's right after a long absence, often it feels like, okay, here they are releasing 2 albums where one should have been done 3 years prior or something like that. But I think this will be a difficult listen for neophytes like myself, just getting in the band. And probably I should have, and I would say for anyone else who's curious, given your review and your praise of the album, to check out their older stuff and then kind of work their way back to this. It's enjoyable. Again, the everything that stands out is very Rotting Christ, is very Greek black metal. I enjoy, but the length at times can feel too much, even within songs themselves. Sometimes kind of feels like cut 2 minutes off of this or a minute off of here. Yeah, it's a very, very big album, and I think people should be aware of that.
Yeah, and I guess not even in the context of this band alone, but for newcomers to Greek black metal, this is not entry level. And I think although it does draw on other scenes and other eras, it helps to have that grounding, because the Greek scene is weird in that it's kind of known for sort of early Rotting Christ, and then people will mention Varathron in the same breath and be like, that is Greek black metal. And to some extent it is. It's a big part of it is the same kind of extremity as the Nordic scene, but a much more explicitly heavy metal influence, a lot more melody, and so on. And just to sort of, for the background for listeners as well, I guess it's also very closely connected to other Greek bands like Septic Flesh and Horrified, who are more on the death metal side, but have a very similar melodic sensibility and flair to them as Rotting Christ and Varathron. There's also Agatus, who started out similar to Rotting Christ and then went just full on heavy metal. And then the guy from Agatus, his brother has a project called Zemail, who also started out more like Bathory and have landed in a much more progressive place, but it's kind of a prog mixed with, I don't know, stuff like Hellhammer and Celtic Frost a little bit. But then there's
I'm familiar with Zemail.
Okay, yeah. He's drumming with Absu.
Came over to play with Absu. So
yeah. So I saw him with Absu last year at Cosmic Void. Coincidentally, I'm wearing my Cosmic Void t-shirt right now, but anyway, that's by the by. But that's all kind of makes sense in terms of the tradition of Greek black metal, but there's also this filthy occultist side to it with bands like Necromantia, Medieval Demon, who are much more kind of dirty, a bit more chaotic in the way they present themselves, and much more theatrical. They're much less concerned with melody and more kind of concerned with delivering a certain mood. And that's where you get a lot of kind of modern, I want to call it occultist black metal, because I guess that's the best word for it. But albums like Scarlet Witch and Black and things like that were very influential in that. And that's where it's also, those bands are closer to bands like Mortuary Drape from Italy. And then also from Italy, you have bands like Necromass, who are closer again to that melodic style. So there's a whole kind of connecting thread of Southern European stuff. The reason I'm going for all of this is because you can hear a lot of this all kind of tied together on this Caedes Cruenta album to some extent. And I'm not saying you have to have done all of this like preparatory reading to like enjoy this album. You will just, if you like this album, you will find things to like about it, regardless of what you know about Greek black metal. It's just, I feel, because it is such a significant piece of work, it helps to connect the dots of what they may be drawing together alongside the Venom and Morbid Angel and Hellhammer influences they're drawing on as well. So I'm almost looking at it as like a celebration of Southern European black metal and how it's distinctive from its Nordic counterpart in a lot of ways, but it feels much more convincing than the efforts that, as I said, people like Varathron and Rotting Christ have put out in recent years, which is one of the reasons why I'm holding it up. But it's
no, I mean, when I mentioned like Return Around Christ, it's usually the 90s material. They've gone in a very different sort of direction the last 20 some years or so. So no, I definitely, for people who miss that kind of 90s sound from those bigger bands, I think this definitely could be very appealing. Also that Morbid Angel cover really did kind of hit me sideways. I was like, wait, what? And the way they interpret it is particularly interesting. I can't talk too much in depth with the album in just because it is such a large meal, as you use the metaphor. So it's kind of hard to digest in a short time with essentially 1.5 listens. But I think anyone who thinks of themselves as someone who is well versed in Greek black metal should probably check it out. Probably, given the nature of how you've got introduced to the band, probably not a bad idea to probably go check out their older material, at least maybe the album before, and then go into this.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. The only other thing I was going to say is the album cover, which it is an enjoyable album cover for what it is. It just kind of made me chuckle a little bit because black metal at large, but I feel like Greek black metal in particular, and maybe throw the Italians in it too, really seems obsessed with that kind of aesthetic. like I can't tell how many times in amongst Verathon and in Rheinchrist and other ones of like some sort of black mass scene painted some kind of romanticism, like 19th century kind of style, with a goat-headed figure leading a black mass and naked women abound. Like it's like, oh, there you go. That's a Greek black metal album cover.
Yep. Varafron's Walpurgis Night, or however you pronounce it, I think very similar. My friend has a Rotten Christ t-shirt with a very similar theme on it as well, with a goat-headed figure. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely agree with that. One last thing on this as well before we move on. Yes, absolutely check out the previous album of Ritual Necrophagia and Mysterious Ghoul Cults. Health warning, that is also an hour long, so it's not exactly a small undertaking either, but anyway. Right, moving on to your next pick, Joseph. I have the Karloff, Revered by Death.
Yes, I believe they are German band. Not the most complicated music, especially compared to like Poison Ruin, where it was naming all sorts of different influences and every song being a bit different. This is much more band, a bit meat and potatoes. They know what they're doing, and they kind of continue doing that. I do think some of the songs stand out in particular. I think Regicide is a particularly good track, and I think that was made a single of sorts, so that makes kind of sense. Relatively new band. This is their second full length. Basically, kind of very in the pocket of mid-paced, punky, sneering kind of black metal with little brushes of that mixture of black and death in the first wave. It brings to mind to me Darkthrone, Samael, pre-industrial Gothic Samael, and along with that, very early kind of Celtic Frost Hellhammer. Definitely some Venom in there, and mix all that with definitely some background in kind of hardcore punk. Nothing overly hyper fast per se, but you definitely get a punk feel to it. At times, kind of a bit of a rock and roll swing, especially in the drum work. But yeah, I don't have a ton to say. This just kind of hit a sweet spot for me. I really do enjoy the Darkthrone material that kind of lends itself to that, as well as early Samael and Venom in particular. I like Venom more than the typical metalhead, I think. So kind of a more hardcore punk themed mix of Venom, Samael, and Darkthrone, I think is a good way of thinking about this.
And a merciful half hour long as well. So you were much kinder than I with that. Yeah, when I hit play and the first track comes in, I immediately thought, oh no, this is the black and roll pick that I'm going to have to shit on, because it starts with a very kind of bouncy, punky rhythm. I mean, it's dark, don't get me wrong, it is still clearly like a metal album, but I was like, oh, it's kind of got that black and roll swing to it that I just can't stand. But as it carries on, it does sort of do just straight up black metal quite a lot, and it has a more cavernous atmosphere than sort of straight up Nordic black metal. It's more German in that regard, I suppose. So the black metal runs they do hit a little bit harder, and it is a good way to kind of balance out the album, because you're right, there's that older kind of influence from punk and from Venom. I mean, to some extent, I wanted to compare it a bit to Midnight as well, because they seem to have a similar set of influences. But this,
Yeah, if Midnight were, I don't know if Midnight weren't taking speed in methamphetamine, like definitely slowed down.
Well, yeah, generally more like deadpan and German take on it, I suppose. Just a little bit darker, a little bit more atmospheric. And yeah, it was kind of a very binary album in that regard, in that some tracks kind of just passed me by and washed over me. Some bits I was like, it has that kind of punky bounce, which doesn't always work in a black metal setting for me. And then other bits were just very kind of straightforwardly black metal, but in a, done really well. I would say as well, I definitely prefer it to later era Darkthrone that leans into this style. I think they do it a little bit more convincingly. I won't get into the politics of Darkthrone just yet, because that'll take us way off track. But I feel like there's just a much more straightforward, less kind of, they're not trying to make a statement with it. They're just, this is the style that they've picked, and they're exploring themselves through that. Whereas Darkthrone always feel like they've got a bone to pick with someone or other when they're doing it, which kind of detracts from the experience to some extent. And as I said, the production on this does really lend itself to the music. It does kind of give it that more heft and a little bit more kind of significance. But yeah, like you, I don't have an awful lot more to say on it, because it is quite a straightforward sort of sparse release, and one of those where you kind of, what you're getting, I suppose.
Yeah, no, I think it's, if you wanted something, I mean, the black and roll comparison not off, like certainly like Satyricon in that era. Like, I think you can think of that. Just, it definitely doesn't go the more anthemic poppy route of like Now Diabolical, maybe a little more akin to the shorter tracks on something like Volcano. It does have kind of an urban decay kind of feel. Like it's definitely not something to listen to out in the woods. It doesn't have that. It's not overly melodic. It's not overly bright in that sense. But yeah, it's very urban, black and roll, mid pace, with a bit of grit to it. And the bands.
And I would say, just as to caveat that, like, I mentioned black and roll, but that was more the rhythm and delivery. But yeah, it's definitely not like, because that's one of the reasons why black and roll always turns me off, because it kind of takes me out of the experience to some extent. But this never kind of lets loose with anything, as you said, anything anthemic or remotely kind of catchy in that sense. It's very deadpan in its delivery still, even when it's doing quite a sort of bouncy rhythm or whatever. There's always this kind of an underlying darkness that I think kind of just kept me on board with the album, when otherwise I would have kind of ignored it were it not for you dropping it in for this. So.
Even probably more severe than, say, even a Satyricon. You mentioned like the German quality of it, and I think it's, if Germans are no fun, then this kind of fits that.
Yeah, pretty much. Okay, so we'll move on to my next pick now, which is an Estonian band called Kodu. Again, I think I'm pronouncing that right. I think there's an accent though. Yeah. Kodu. And I can't pronounce the name of the album, but I'm going to give it a shot, so apologies, everyone. Kirjad, sõgedate, külast. That's my best shot. And I did actually I did actually whack it into translate before we hit record, and I'll just do that again now because I've completely forgotten. Letters from the Blind Village. That's right. Yeah, it's so this is kind of a concept album, and I think it is literally, yeah, it's sort of written around a series of letters, and that's why all of the track titles are just numerical. But this is another one where they released an album again, 2021. I thought it was older than that, and it was probably on the same list as the previous one we were discussing because it was also one of my albums of the year. But their first album was completely different. It was straight up kind of dissonant black metal, basically. But I always felt it had a little bit more purpose and structure than what I've heard of Despel Omega and that kind of thing. But it was very much like a non-linear black metal, shall we say. Whereas this one, they've been gestating for a while. I think they've had a few shuffles around in the lineup as well. And they've come up with this, which is not a straightforward album by any measure. But and there is still some dissonance in there, but that's not the defining feature. I would say broadly it's more of a progressive black metal album. But it's much more eclectic. There's elements of folk, there's elements of avant-garde, there's elements of more straightforward black metal, and lots of other kind of vignettes in there. So it was another one that a band I was familiar with. They ended up surprising me, but in a much more kind of easy to understand kind of way, in that there is a clear continuity between this and the debut, but it is still sort of strikingly different in that regard. And also it is a half hour long, but this is one that actually does feel quite a lot longer just because of the amount of kind of styles they managed to pack in, and it feels like quite a passionate, emotive album, but not kind of overwrought. It kind of feels more like a piece of theatre, and I think that kind of again feeds into the fact that they're using a lot of different instrumentation on here. You can hear a lot of acoustic instruments alongside the usual black metal stuff and some keyboards and things. So it feels like yeah, it literally feels quite dramatic in quite a literal sense of the term, and a little bit lyrical in places as well. So yeah, very tight, like very neat album. And I guess it's one of these where I had certain expectations because their first album was so distinctive, and they subverted them. But when that happens with a band, you either get over it and learn to forgive them, or you kind of just take it as a great disappointment. Whereas this one is like, no, fair enough, they are. For anyone that was familiar with them, I think they were relatively obscure, but like they have challenged any sort of preconception of them, and it's almost like listening to a new band. But yeah, I think it's probably one of the most interesting black metal albums this year that I've heard so far, and it's definitely worth checking out for fans of black metal. It's a little bit more musical, but it's definitely not obnoxiously so. But yeah, what did you think of this one?
It's hard to say, either just the merits of the albums themselves, this one and the next one, or just given the contrast to what I've said about the previous two, that I'm really picking and choosing based on song and album length, because your two most economical albums were the ones that made the biggest impression on me. And this one is one of those. It is surprising. Like, you listen to the album and then you look at the time and you go, wait, really? Only like barely above 31 minutes? Which for some of the previous bands or anything proggy, that's practically an EP. I have not heard the debut album, so this was an introduction to me for the band in general. I really enjoyed it. Very melodic and harmonic focus, kind of black metal. At times kind of hard to pin what kind of bands I would necessarily compare it to. But definitely harmonic, and the production work on it in some ways kind of reminds me of what I was saying with Poison Ruin, in that it's very well produced and a lot of extra flourishes and bells and whistles get added, which add these sort of elements of character to the songs. Like the second track in particular, like a piano comes in that really adds something to it. And then immediately after the piano, you hear what I think is a hammered dulcimer, which it's been a while since I've heard that in a metal band. So that really caught me by surprise. It's very hooky. I think, and when I say melodic black metal, I don't necessarily think it's like dissection necessarily, but I mean, it is well produced, melodic, and it is without a doubt black metal. And as you said, I think definitely progressive at times in terms of what it's doing and all the different little influences it's interweaving. But yeah, very enjoyable. One I think I would definitely want to give more time and attention to.
I mean, we joke, but I do think this is the sub theme of this episode is definitely runtime does matter, and it will endear you to a band more when they manage to convey something within a kind of quote unquote reasonable runtime, which is anything around the 40-minute mark in my book, because that's kind of what a standard vinyl record used to be. Yeah. But I just say this one is progressive in the exact opposite way that the Cryptic Shift is progressive, in that it has all of that flair, but it's very tight and very compact and very kind of, not stripped down, because the music still spreads out in a lot of different directions, but it does so very efficiently, I suppose, whereas the Cryptic Shift takes ages to get through an expression or whatever. But yeah, I think in terms of comparisons, the only band that came to mind for me is another local band for me that have just released a new album, A Forest of Stars, who are like avant-garde black metal, again, for want of a better word, but
Forest has that kind of like spoken word quality, which
yes, yeah,
I don't really feel that with Kodu. Like, I don't want anyone to get that impression. No,
there are very clear differences, but it was the only band I could think that kind of at certain sequences I was like, oh yeah, there's an overlap there, but yeah, Forest of Stars are very kind of, with the spoken word thing, explicitly kind of English in that regard. But yeah, it's an odd album, and yeah, definitely for anyone that's kind of interested in black metal that's a little bit different, but not obnoxiously so, I would definitely say it's worth checking out. Cool. So moving on to your next pick, this is the Templar Conquering Swords.
This is, I think when we did our roundup last year, I had probably Morax was that. I make no bones about it that I love traditional heavy metal, especially when I feel like it is done well. And this so far, along with one or two other albums, is definitely hitting that for me this year. You see that album cover and it's going to scream 80s fantasy metal. I mean, literally, it's like a Conan the Barbarian watercolor with a elongated dragon, which, if anyone remembers old internet lore, kind of reminded me of what was that thing? The Dragonator stuff. Musically, the band is from Sweden, and in particular taps into a lot of old school Swedish heavy metal. Bands like Heavy Load, Gotham City, which, if one's 80s metal knowledge is a bit limited to the bigger names of new wave of British heavy metal and then lead into thrash, may entirely be foreign to them. But Heavy Load in particular, I think, were one of the best of the 80s. Very unfortunate that they kind of had a brief moment and then kind of disappeared. They recently kind of came back, but then I think a member died. So I think any future of them seems pretty uncertain. But even the vocals, the way they're sung, oftentimes brings to mind Heavy Load. Another thing about them is they're very much tied in with another Swedish band named Century, or other kind of young upstarts. That band being much more new wave British heavy metal aligned. Like I often think of especially Angel Witch, but the main guy of that band, Stefan Tengner, helped record this album, so there's very much a connection to that. Again, musically, just very triumphant heavy metal. To me, the riffing is exceptional. Every song has a riff that just makes me want to nod, if not just full on bang my head. And a band that I very, very much wish gets brought over to the States, because I would love to see this live.
So, I was just clicking through the Mail Archives page while you were talking. Do you remember where you were when 9/11 happened?
Yes.
So Templar don't, because none of them were born.
I mean, yeah, as someone who, yeah, they're very, very, very young.
I think the oldest member was born in 2003.
Yeah. I mean, as someone who works in education, for a couple of years now, it's dawned on me that teenagers have no idea what 9/11 or a lot of major world events I experienced were. Probably even the Iraq War at this point.
I mean, yeah, okay. Of course, I've come across younger bands. I think the youngest one I came across was born in 2009, which I just couldn't believe at the time when I was looking them up to write a review. The reason I'm bringing it up for Templar is because this just sounds like it was made in the 80s. Like it's so...
Oh, yeah.
I know kind of retro metal has been done to death at this point in all different subgenres, but this one really felt like it's not trying to be pastiche. It just feels like you've just recommended me an old album. And when I was looking into them, I was like, well, are they literally an old band that have just made a comeback album or just put out a new album? It's like, oh no, they're all children, basically. But it made me glad that we did the episode on US power metal, because it felt very much like it digging deeper into just heavy metal in general outside of the big names that I already knew meant that I could kind of process this one a little bit more, other than just saying, right, well, yep, that's another heavy metal album. But
I mean, this is definitely one where it's like, yeah, in terms of young blood showing up at like Hell's Heroes, this is like a picture perfect band for that.
Yeah, even, and I don't mean this disparagingly, but even to the extent that it's quite rough is the wrong word, but like the vocals aren't like all that strong. They're a little bit like, they're ambitious, definitely, but there's a little bit where it's
there's
like
there's not an attempt to polish things up. Even compared to like bands in the 80s, like, you know, Tokyo Blade or something like that. Like this is very much more like the early sort of stuff, no polish.
Yes, definitely. And that's why I was saying I was kind of glad that I'd listened to so much US power metal, because it kind of desensitized me to some of that. Like obviously with the classic bands from the 80s, there's a diversity of quality in terms of the talent, but you kind of get used to some bands going for that theatrical style, not quite being able to pull it off, but there's still like a charm to it, or you kind of admire the ambition. And that's kind of the impression I got here as well, is you still get that like cinema to it and that sense of occasion, but it is still very kind of, as you said, unpolished. There's no attempt to like fix anything in the production, auto tune or anything like that. And that goes for the music as well. It's very kind of straightforward. And this is what I meant. It doesn't feel like pastiche in any way. Like I'm more familiar with pastiche and say the sort of old school death metal thing. But you could kind of tell in that style bands that are literally trying to sound like Autopsy or Entombed or whatever, and really leaning into that aesthetic as well as trying to just rewrite some of their riffs. Whereas this didn't feel like it was trying to do the same thing for any particular like classic band. It felt more like it was just of that era to that extent. And for the fact that they're so young, that does make it more impressive, because it does take a degree of knowledge to kind of to pull that off. It feels like you're getting a more authentic experience, and it maybe it comes from a place of kind of love of that style. I would also say for me personally as well, like I'm less familiar with, because I know Sweden had a big like heavy metal scene back in the day as well, which I'm much less familiar with, only to the extent that like Bathory appeared on that compilation and stuff. But so I don't know if there's like a Swedish influence that I'm missing from it. But yeah, for me, it very much kind of sat within that tradition to the extent that it could have just come from that era, which was interesting.
As a side note, I've thought as an addendum to our chat about US Power, we could do a Euro metal of the 80s that's a bit more on the obscure side, I guess. Euro heavy, because like if you haven't heard Heavy Load much, like when I hear Templar, I hear a lot of Heavy Load.
I mean, yeah, we could definitely do that. Like I would be starting from an even sort of more ignorant place than we did with the US power metal stuff, because at least with some of those bands I had heard at least a handful of albums. But with Euro heavy, unless we're talking like Halloween.
Well, that's the thing. Like these are all bands outside of the realm of Halloween and Gamma Ray and that kind of the power metal trajectory. But at the same time, like these were bands that were clearly like Heavy Load. The first album was in '78. Like Heavy Load are kind of the Manila Road of Sweden in a lot of ways.
Okay, yeah. No, definitely up for that. And this is one of those albums where I do want to unpack it a bit more, because sometimes it's sort of I guess this is a problem when you're approaching a genre you're less familiar with. I'm not listening to the subtleties of it so much, and more just taking in the experience as a whole. But yeah, there's definitely kind of certain riffs I want to pick into more, certain tracks where maybe the narrative means a little bit more. And yeah, just looking at the cover as well, it's very much like it's not overwrought or overly polished or anything. It's very kind of not naive, what's the word, just understated.
It looks like a very very talented high school, like,
yes, yeah,
level of talent.
Yeah, pretty much. Someone's kind of colored in a don't know color by numbers, but it very kind of that kind of almost lends it another kind of mystical quality, and that nothing is overstated, nothing is but that comes through in the music as well, in terms of it's still very kind of understated. It's not smacking around the face, not like, I don't know, sort of bands like Visigoth or something where it's very kind of in your face and upfront like that. So yeah,
that polish and sheen just isn't there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. Cool. So yeah, I don't have anything else to say on this one unless you do.
No, I think we covered it well. I think we could move to your next.
Cool. So my final pick was a band called Oraculum from Chile. Because it wouldn't be a Shelley list without a death metal pick from Chile. And this was very early on. I think this is one of the first albums I've reviewed this year. Came out in January. And it was actually Jason that turned me on to this one. He just sent me the link with no explanation, as he sometimes does. But I appreciate it all the same because normally when he does that, it is something worth checking out, unless it's Russian hardcore or something, which he sometimes still sends me. But this band, now I think about it, it's the only band I've picked that I had not heard of before this came out, and this is their debut album. I think they've had a couple of EPs before this. But unlike other bands from Chile, death metal bands, that although they kind of do come from a broad range of styles, they tend to lean more into the American styles, particularly Florida. So I'm thinking bands like Mortuary, Blood Oath, Sepulchrum. They're all drawing very much from like the Floridian scene in their influences and doing something different with it. I think Suppression being another one as well that go more of the progressive route, but you can definitely hear the Floridian style in there. This is a very different beast. I mean, for me, I'd kind of describe it as I want to say haunted bolt thrower, but I think people already describe Desecracy as that. But there's a definite bolt thrower influence in there, but it's much more cavernous. And I would say they are still fast. They're not leaning into the mid-pace stuff. I'd say it's like early bolt thrower, kind of Realm of Chaos era, mixed with maybe the kind of Swedish sense of gravity, bit of like, you know, in early Entombed Carnage kind of style. But then it kind of combines that with this very epic feel. Like I'd call it epic death metal to some extent. The production is kind of very throbbing, very cavernous, but not excessively so. I think the problem with a lot of what's sort of commonly called caverncore, but is often just called black and death metal or something, is it tends to just lean on that production and kind of assume that that's just going to overwhelm the listener with enough kind of substance that they don't end up writing anything. Whereas I think here it's tight enough that the songs still speak for themselves, but that production really does just lend it this kind of biblical weight. And the vocals also, there's some clean passages in here, but there's also, the vocals are very kind of passionate, shall we say. They're kind of half clean wailing a lot of the time, which again, it makes it feel like the stakes are somehow higher. So yeah, you get a lot of that up front, but I also think the songwriting is very tight. The riffing's very tight. There's a lot to kind of unpack, and it's kind of similar to a lot of Chilean bands that I've come across. They take a style either from Northern Europe or from America and just make it their own. And I think that's what makes, not just from Chile, actually from South America in general, what makes a lot of extreme metal from that region very kind of compelling in a way that a lot of other scenes are kind of struggling to compete with at the moment. It just feels that little bit more authentic because they kind of just raise the stakes. They're not adding new styles. They're not kind of branching out into completely new territory. They're just doing pre-existing things really well. And I think this is a really good example of that. So yeah, I don't think I have too much more to say other than just a very solid death metal release with those kind of epical qualities to it. But yeah, what did you think of this one?
I really enjoyed it, and I have to give big props to Jason for linking it to you because yeah, I'm really happy I got to hear this. I think of all your picks, this might be my favorite. I did really enjoy the Kodu as well. And like that, this is a little bit longer, but it is absolutely in that traditional LP length framework, and I think it really works well for them. You mentioned the bolt thrower. I definitely hear that at times. I think as well, like I was looking up some reviews and I saw people mention Asphyx and Morgoth as well. And that definitely, I think after reading that, kind of colored that. Yeah, I can see that. It's funny, like the Chilean bands in a lot of South America and outside of Brazil, I've often had a hard time really latching myself to, either because some of them just never seem to change the pace of the songs. Like there is just a feeling of no matter how long the album is, just trying to get as much in as fast as possible. And here is a band that definitely feels to take their time, definitely allows space for the notes to ring a little bit. It just never feels like they're in a rush to get it done. And I think you even in your review, you said something that really stuck with me. You said they are strikingly tentative in how they pace these tracks out, making the flow torturous rather than chaotic. And I think maybe that's the chaos in some of the bands in that scene is something that has pushed me away. And this not being the case here has really made it appealing to me. Another thing, the vocals are like one thing that kind of kills death metal for me is when the vocals are extremely monotone. It's not a concern here. I actually think they're quite interesting. And the solos and lead work on this album is top notch. Like it is some of my, probably my favorite death metal lead guitar work of the year is on this album. It's just really well done. The production is clean without being sterile at all. You really can hear everything. Yeah, a great album, and one that, especially for like a brand new band like this and still what is kind of an exotic scene, I'd love to see these guys, get picked up by MDF to play over here or another big festival. Cause, yeah, this stuff needs to be known by more people.
Oh yeah, definitely. We should. Well, we did a full episode on Chilean death metal last year, but it's interesting to unpack because that's true of some bands. Maybe more on the thrashing side as well for me.
Yeah.
I do see variety, but I think the difference with these guys is, well, yeah, that sort of line that I was trying to point out in the review is taking their time. Like it starts with an intro, but it is an intro where it's not just an ambient intro; it's the full band playing, but it's a slow build. I guess that's kind of where an Asphyx comparison could be made, but also taking the time. And I think this is sort of the last point I'll sort of say on this album because it's a more general point, not just about Chilean death metal, but death and thrash, modern death and thrash in general is. People not taking their time or feeling like if they do take their time, they have to go full on into kind of a doom metal territory. And I always point to an album like Soulside Journey here to say that is an album that has a lot of tension. It has a lot of sustained notes. Everything feels a little bit uncomfortable, but it's nowhere near a doom metal album. It's still, on paper, a straightforward death metal album, weird as it is, but it's very spacious and opened out and tense. And I feel like it's an art that's sort of been lost to some extent because people are just trying to throw in as many ideas as they can without kind of taking the time to allow the music to breathe to some extent. And I think, this is a good example of where things are just allowed to settle a little bit. And it does create that tension. And it's not sort of sensory overload or anything. It just has a bit of an atmosphere to it.
Yeah, great album.
Speaking of atmosphere, your final pick, definitely my favorite pick from the ones you've selected, and I'm going to butcher the pronunciation again. Is it Selenite or Selenite? The Selenite scrolls.
I want to say Selenites, but
okay.
Yeah, I could be wrong.
So the Selenite scrolls channeling the Egregore.
Yep. And I have to thank Neil Jameson of Krieg on his Substack. I think within the last month or so, he mentioned this is an album worth getting attention, and thank goodness for that, because not everything he recommends like hits for me. Although I do He's, championed. I mentioned Neodolk for last year, and he was a big champion of that. So I look at him as someone who does really kind of pick out stuff that can appeal to me. And this absolutely was that. Although unlike Neodolk, this isn't exactly a punky black metal album at all. This is extremely atmospheric, very occult, very ritualistic and meditative. It's just like the Greek black metal that you mentioned, Caedes, Cruenta. This is only available on YouTube right now. I would love for it to eventually get a vinyl release, but even a Bandcamp would be nice. So you do have to go on there to get it. When I heard it the first time, even before hearing the music, I kind of was pulled in because the opening orchestration, which they clearly sampled and altered a little bit, is the main theme from one of my favorite movies, The Ninth Gate. So that immediately caught my attention. And then once the music actually kicks in, like I said, it's sort of this furious lo-fi black metal, but at the same time, not so lo-fi as to be indiscernible. The riffing really sort of builds on itself, but it's very paced out, again, with that meditative, ritualistic sort of aspect to it. And then the keys and orchestration really give it life, add this other element to it that really... I was trying to think of how to express it in sort of like the metal side of this album feels very much like the moral expression towards the ethereal or towards the other side, and the keys kind of feel like the ethereal coming to meet it. It at times reminded me much more of fast paced, but Beherit's Drawing Down the Moon, as well as Immortals' first album, Diabolical Mysticism. I know in your review you mentioned Ancient Gehenna, and I definitely feel that in it as well. I think this is just a really excellent work, and I don't always love black metal that tends to be super on the atmospheric side and ritualistic, but the other great thing is the album is not insanely long. Does not drag out for forever. The songs are reasonably paced, which I think is to credit to a lot of those 90s bands that even when they were atmospheric and ritualistic, they rarely took it into excess. This album is that, but it is economical, like a lot of that 90s black metal was.
Yeah, this is what I call in my head haunted house black metal. It's just a sort of, it's just a vibe I get off, and there's been enough albums over the years that have invoked that in me that I've just started labeling it that, because yes, it has that occultist feel. Totally agree with all of the kind of influences you've referenced there, but it has that kind of gothic quality, and that's borne out by the cover art as well, which is effectively a seance.
It looks straight up like a pencil drawing cover of like a Hellboy seance scene. Yes,
yeah, definitely. So it has that kind of quirky quality to it, but when you listen to the music itself, if you ignored the cover, I wouldn't call the album quirky in any way, but more dramatic and theatrical, and has that kind of sense of occasion, I suppose. And I guess what I was trying to pull out in the review was the fact that this is a case of minimalist composition, in the sense that the writing is very tight, nothing is overplayed, nothing is overly showy, but it does exactly what it needs to do. But it's maximalist production, in that you have all of these bells and whistles. You mentioned kind of the keyboards and the importance they have on the album, but also the guitar tone, definitely the vocals, and the way the sort of drums are presented as well. Very kind of straightforward and linear, but doing exactly what they need to do to kind of hammer home the intensity at different phrases of the pieces, and then just all these other kind of things. What's the word? Stimulating the senses. And I think, it's interesting you mentioned Immortal's debut, because that's obviously a very different kettle of fish to the albums that followed, but it has that similar quality of, it feels like being in the woods and you're hearing things from all different angles and trying to discern what that sound might have been, where is it coming from, echoing around, and you're getting that kind of disorientating panorama of different things surrounding you. And this album has that similar quality of just sort of being surrounded by unknown sounds coming from unknown sources and trying to kind of piece it together. And it's interesting what you said about kind of the role that the guitars play in potentially being more grounded, and then the keyboards being sort of the other side, and they're sort of playing out this kind of conflict or interaction across the album. And to that extent, it does mirror a lot of that similar kind of mystical black metal albums. I think Ancient's debut is definitely one that does that. It's definitely Drawing Down the Moon. But this one, similar to some of the other albums on here, it's not reinventing the wheel or anything. It's picked its style, it's expressing it incredibly well, and it feels very authentic in that regard. It's not trying to tick a bunch of boxes to satisfy a certain kind of fan. It's just celebrating the style, finding their own voice within it, which I think is kind of the most important thing at this point, because we're not really going to get like an album that sort of completely reinvents metal at this point. There's just too much of it out there. But what we can get is albums that find their own spaces within these styles and do it really well. And you can get albums like the Cryptic Shift that make a show of trying to go all the way, but they will end up sort of alienating some people and then kind of overstretching themselves a little bit in places, but kind of admire the effort. But this one kind of is very comfortable in its niche and it does it really well. Thoroughly enjoyed that one. And you recommended to me a few weeks before this podcast, but I did write up a review for it as well. But thanks to Neil for throwing that one out there.
Yep.
Cool. Should we start shitting on Darkthrone then?
So for listeners out there, we mentioned if we had time to discuss potentially some albums on our list that we didn't mention because, what is there to say other than what other people have said, either because they're so big or whatnot. And for me, two that I might have ranked a bit higher than, say, Karloff and Templar were the new Darkthrone and the new Worm albums. But I didn't feel like people were aware of those albums. I didn't feel like I needed to praise them to people who have maybe not heard them. And for you, that might be the new Immolation to some extent, or maybe another album.
Well, I'll quickly mention the Forest of Stars. I won't go into detail because I didn't mention that on the thread before, but it did just occur to me when I was talking about them earlier on. So they did put an album out in May, and they're another one where their albums are pretty long. It takes a while to kind of unpack what they're doing. I think I'm still in that process, but I did get the opportunity to see them at Fortress Festival in Scarborough a few weeks ago, which was a really good festival. Lots of great bands. Vinterland played.
I had some friends who go. A friend of mine actually from Pennsylvania went out there, and he was telling me the only difficult thing I think he said was like Friday night there was nowhere to eat. Like the entire town was shut down, and then Saturday, I guess everyone coming in from the cities, everything was active and going. But he said it was like a ghost town on Friday.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember where I ate now on Friday, but because Scarborough's quite a small town, and small towns tend to shut early. So you gotta know where you're going, or just sort of do some. You can't just sort of wander down a high street and sort of hope that somewhere is open. You've got to kind of do some Googling and pick a place. Did
you see the Acker Cookie set?
I didn't watch that one. No.
Okay, they're bringing that to MDF, and I was thrilled about that because that was one of the things that was tempting me to try to get out there for.
Right. Okay. Um, well, I should say, like, yeah, I watched Doddenheim Scarred. They were really good, even though I'm not that into them. But they did all of their newest album, which was very impressive. Like I said, sort of Interland, Mortis, Old Sorcery. The Dungeon Sim stage was generally pretty great. And yeah, and Midnight Odyssey as well. They came over from Australia. They're playing a few shows in Europe. They were pretty good, although they had their click track playing out front as well, and not just in their in-ear monitors, was a bit unfortunate. But anyway, but yeah, saw a Forest of Stars, and they were on early. They were on at like midday, so they only had 40 minutes, and that's about 3 songs for them. But they finished with one of the songs from their new album, and it was like the last song. I can't remember the name of it, but it kind of started to really resonate with me again. And it's kind of what the Forest of Stars doing what they do, which is this kind of very eclectic mix. You mentioned the spoken word. They've got elements of folk. There's a full-time violinist. They have elements of prog, elements of like classic black metal and avant-garde black metal. And this is the bit where when I say it, it sounds shit, but it trust me, it works. It's the sort of steampunk Victoriana element to them, which yeah, just it sounds like a complete kind of novelty gimmick thing, but it really does work when you actually see them play it out on stage, well, and on record as well. It definitely isn't for everybody, but yeah, I would definitely recommend that. And then the moment they stopped playing, everyone had applauded them. They started packing up, and then I was with my mate, and they were playing Into the Infinity of Thoughts by Emperor, and he kind of tapped me on the shoulder. And I was like, I thought they just started playing music while people are milling around, grabbing drinks and stuff. And then on the screen behind them, they just put up Emperor Fortress Festival 2027. And then everyone was like, way.
Yeah, and apparently that's led to like 80% of tickets for next year before the rest of the lineups announced already sold out.
Yep, we've already bought ours because we were like, this is going to sell out quickly, so we just need to fork out the cash. So and it's quite expensive as well. So yeah. Anyway, yeah. So Darkthrone.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about writing a piece on that at some point. I can't say that I'm not just biased in a way than that. Like I am one of those fans who carried on getting introduced to them in terms of contemporary albums around the time of Hate Them, and then going in the old stuff. I was never someone who was just like, oh, they sucked after the 90s or whatnot, and I just always kept on going with them. And there are certain albums I prefer more than others, but to me, it's just like, it's like a family member's band. And every time they release something, I'm going to check it out. And usually I don't even know how I really will feel about it till it's a year or two later. But so far I've been thoroughly enjoying prehistoric metal. And to me, it's just sort of like a comfortable beer. Go to a pub and enjoy. Yeah, that's, I could go further into it, and honestly I would need to spend a little more time the specific songs and whittle certain things out. But like a lot of the more recent albums, I think for a lot of people maybe it blends into a big mass that they don't enjoy, whereas for me it's just a big I don't know, like collage of things in a cool little hangout room.
Like trying to weigh what I cozy. What I say here. So, well, because to some extent, I don't even care about the music anymore because I know what they're going to do. I don't hate it, but I just feel like they've been doing that kind of thing for a long time now, and it's drawing on music that is already kind of out there. I don't know, like you could just listen to the bands that Fenriz recommends, who to my mind tend to do it better.
And I could, I mean, in the same extent, like a lot of the bands I already mentioned, like the ones we reviewed, other than maybe Poison Ruin, like all the other three, it's like I could just listen to those other bands.
Well, I meant more just if you want. I don't know. With the newer Darkthrone, it's like, okay, so there's a Hellhammer riff, there's a Sodom riff, there's a like Doomia riff, there's a Black Sabbath riff, and yeah, I get the whole kind of love-in thing of it's just two older guys kind of resting on their laurels. And this is the thing. So for context, for anyone that doesn't know, I wrote a piece on the album when it came out, basically, but it wasn't on the album at all. It was literally just, I was being deliberately provocative in that way that I am sometimes, but it's that calling out that attitude of everyone that kind of, to no pun intended, but circles the wagons whenever Darkthrone release an album and says like, this is Darkthrone doing what they do and you have to celebrate it and it's a big love-in. And it's kind of like, can we just not? Can we just maybe just ignore it? And because there's more interesting music out there. And I don't begrudge Darkthrone themselves for wanting to do that. But I hate this kind of false positivity around it and the amount of like special editions that come with it and the trading cards and everything. It feels so infantilizing to the point where I'm just like, why are we actually doing this? Are we collecting toys or are we listening to music? But I will say a but here. I did get an interesting comment because I was quoting some reviews from other sites that were kind of doing this thing of saying no one cares, but it's great. And I was like, well, what are you doing? Are you reviewing music or are you just trying to sort of convince yourself of this thing? But someone left a comment saying one of the purpose of reviews is to provide context to a release, and context really does matter, especially in the case of Darkthrone. You can't review it like you would a brand new band, just because there's too much context to deal with. And this is why sometimes I do struggle to review albums by well-established bands with a lot of lore behind them to some extent, because I'm so used to reviewing newer bands or much smaller underground releases where you kind of you do have to frame it and provide it that context and think, well, what are they actually adding? What are they adding anything, or are they saying a little bit like what I was talking about with the Selenite scrolls? Actually, is they're not adding anything particularly new, but what they are doing is talking very well in a pre-existing language because there's so much kind of history behind it. And that would be a very different thing if I was actually doing a review of the new Darkthrone. So I get it to that extent. But it's, as I said, it's similar to how I feel when I see Corpse Grinder posing with toys online. It's kind of like this whole kid-alt thing. I've started to kind of lose patience with it to some extent, and I feel like everyone just turns into mindless kids whenever a band like Darkthrone releases an album, and we all have to sort of clap when we're just being served the same stuff over and over again.
I mean, I think the one thing that inevitably you deal with certain bands with long fan bases is that sometimes you get annoyed with the fans more so than with the band themselves. And
yes,
I think that might be happening here with Darkthrone. And I guess I'm coming from the perspective of someone who is a dyed-in-the-wool hardcore Darkthrone fan who also thinks some of those people you're pointing out are being fucking assholes and should probably just shut the fuck up. But at the same time, quietly saying, yeah, I love this. I'm going to love this. Yeah, maybe an album here, an album there. Not as great. Like, what was it? Like Arctic Thunder. Yeah, I don't like that one. But yeah, I don't think you're wrong. I don't think you're mistaken in thinking some people are just I don't know, turning it into just like a safety blanket of sorts. And the commercialization of it, I mean, yeah, there's all these little things, but generally that's in like the big box set versions of these albums, which admittedly I have, I think 3 of those. So I'm not outside of that realm necessarily, but I'm probably not going to get it for this one just because I don't feel like dishing the cash out for it. But it's not like, I think like, you know, it's not like there's Darkthrone Funko Pops or whatever, or the Cannibal Corpse thing of the toys and things. And I think it's just some cool little extras, like where it was like the French comic book artist who was doing illustrations for them, like at their practice and rehearsal room. It's fun. I think the other thing with Darkthrone is like certain bands like this, it's like it is sort of a metal lifer kind of thing, and it's just sort of like being a fellow traveler with this band and getting old, and in my case now definitely in middle age, and kind of experiencing, a band likewise, although a good 15 to almost probably 20 years older than me, going through that. So it's just sort of like the life of a band, and a band in particular who doesn't have to deal with being worn down by the road, and instead is really just sort of expressing themselves as individuals without the concern of that, and really without financial concerns either. Like, I mean, at this point, they really could do anything and it just doesn't matter. Like, they're not worried about, oh, well, we got to get a good enough album so that we can get on the tour and get to the festival. Like, there's no demands on them at all.
Well, yeah, and I
think
this is... Sorry, go on.
No, just I think that's an appeal to Darkthrone being very unique in that way, and probably comparable to some artists. And off the top of my head, it'd be hard to compare, but how some people have sort of feel relationship to people like what's his name, the singer of Faith No More, or certain other artists who've just kind of had a wide breadth of work, or back in the day, Frank Zappa, I guess.
Was it Matt Pike or something? Faith No More.
Yeah, Mike Patton.
Sorry,
yeah. Or it's the other thing where even like Bob Dylan fans who I kind of have a hard time like years ago trying to dig into Dylan's discography and kind of going, after 76, do I really need to hear anything? But at the same time, I don't begrudge the people who kept on going, or like, I mean, the most notorious, the Grateful Dead, where, yeah, I guess Darkthrone in a certain sense is a lifestyle. And within the lifestyle, you get the really fucking annoying fans, whether it's like Tool, Grateful Dead, Fish, or whatever else. There's some fucking annoying people out there, but I'm not going to begrudge it, I think, necessarily, because it does appeal to me on its own merits. But at the same time, yeah, some other people who say it appeals to them, they're a bunch of fucking pricks.
Yeah, it's more complicated than selling out, because you're right. Like, if it was just about the money, they would play live, because God knows how much money's riding on that. And it is clearly done from a place of passion. But it's also that thing of, like you said, they could literally do anything at this point, but they're not. They're just doing the same thing. And I don't begrudge them that. They've earned the right to do that. They've done enough at this point. But I think with Darkthrone in particular is because I remember the moment they, quote unquote, gave up after bloody Sardonic Wrath. They released The Cult Is Alive. And I remember that album coming out and think it just being so... Like, I wasn't a huge fan of Sardonic Wrath, but I was like, it still feels like they're trying. And now and that was the point where after that, they decided that they were going to start going meta, for want of a better word, sort of start talking about the people that they don't like in the scene, the people that have copied them. And then that it kind of, they've gone through several phases of that now. But I guess it's because I've sort of lived that journey on the other side, in that I'm outside of the Darkthrone tent to some extent, and I've just been watching with increasingly raised eyebrows of just sort of why are we doing this. I get where you're coming from with your explanation around it being a lifestyle and so on, but I guess it's sort of a lifestyle I don't want, and would start to question what other people. I mean,
the other thing too, I mean, in Sardonic Wrath, it's probably the last time they were black metal in any kind of true sense, and for me that's been fine. Like, I mean, two of my favorite albums I probably listen to as much, if not more, than the Peaceful suite, throwing a few others into that, is Circle the Wagons and the Underground Resistance. To me, a few albums before that, like, I think they just became a heavy metal band. Like, I call them blackened heavy metal. Like,
Yeah.
It's so for me, it's fine. Like I don't is in particular, I do not judge anything they've done for the last 20-18 years under the guises of black metal at all. To me,
I
I
wouldn't
would
judge
put
it
them.
as black metal at all. I get that. I'm not saying, oh, they just need to go back to doing Transylvanian Hunger. I'm saying like,
Yeah.
okay, but what they're doing, just I would rather listen to all those US power metal bands that we discussed a few months ago. Like, I would rather listen to that than, I mean, yeah, okay, I quite like the Underground Resistance for what it was, but again, I'm still sort of thinking, well, I just want to listen to the albums that it's drawing on because, just
Yeah,
Darkthrone aren't
I
that
mean,
good at it.
yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. I think it's just I don't think in yeah, I think anyone who's saying you have to like this because it's so irrelevant is kind of doing a dickish thing. Like and screw that, screw whoever's saying that.
Mm. I
But
mean,
I think
um,
yeah,
to move this on a little bit, because I feel a similar
yeah,
thing with Immolation. Um,
mm,
it's a similar situation to some extent. It's effectively a band that's run around a duo. I know they have
mhm,
other members, and Steve Shaladi, the drummer, has been with them for many years now. But
yeah,
it's a similar thing where I kind of broke with the fan base, and I know exactly when. It was in 2010 when they released Majesty and Decay, and
mm,
it's different to some extent because Immolation are not just my favorite death metal band, but they are the band that got me to understand death metal as an art form. I remember buying Dawn of Possession very, very early on. I'd heard sort of Morbid Angel and Carcass and things, but I was still very much in the black metal camp and thinking, well, I should give the death metal a try, but I don't think it's for me. And then I heard Dawn of Possession, and it kind of all sort of slid into place. So I've been very, very passionate about this band, and I really wanted to love Majesty and Decay, and there are elements to it that I do
mm,
still like, and I think it's not a terrible album by any measure. And there are elements of subsequent albums that I have liked. Atonement has its moments, even if I do think it's a bit dry and a bit stale. But it's a similar thing, a bit less like obnoxious than the Darkthrone crowd, because Immolation themselves, they're much more understated. They're just generally down to earth, very nice guys. Like, I don't think anyone could have a bad word to say about them as people. But it's a similar thing of them. I get this sense of them resting on their laurels.
mhm,
They're releasing albums that they're still very much in their style. They're still very much death metal, recognizably Immolation. There's a clear continuity across their discography. But I do feel like they've just almost kind of paused developing themselves. And again, I wrote a very long, very deliberately provocative review. Actually, this one was less deliberately provocative. I did sort of try and analyze the history of the band based on the book that Decibel released, I think it was last year,
mhm,
Into Everlasting Fire. Just very good book in its own right, but it was quite revealing in how a band, when they get older, especially a band that didn't really have the success that they deserved as much as Immolation, they do kind
yeah,
of fall into ways that are convenient. And again, not begrudging Immolation that they've earned the right to, work remotely, not travel as much as they might have to, get together to sort of rehearse prior to touring and things like that. Not cut corners, but just use technology, modern technology, to kind of do things a little bit differently. But I think it has been directly detrimental to their writing process, the fact that they don't do it in the same room. And Rob Vigner basically does everything at his desk, to the extent that he lays down drum arrangements as well. And Steve Schlatter just kind of fleshes them out a little bit. And I think that has degraded the quality of their albums over the years. And I think the fan base, some fans do clock it. It's like they can tell that the album is leaving them a little bit cold, but they can't put their finger on why. Other fans are very much just, you need to like this album. And if you don't like this album, then there's something wrong with you, or you just don't want us to have fun, or, you're
yeah.
just bitter for the sake of it. It's like, no, just, you don't have to agree with me. If you genuinely enjoy it, fine. I can't do anything about that. But, but it's this sort of,
I think, yeah. I mean, I think there's a similar. It's interesting because we might want to bow tie it for here and then bring this back up in another episode, because I think it would be interesting, especially if Tyler and some other people's opinions. But I guess the idea of like, what do you do and what do you deal with bands that have become institutions, and how do you deal with that where at a certain point maybe you just entirely cut off from a band, like they've done everything they said and they're just kind of running on repeat? Or are you the type of fan where you keep on going, but not every album you love, and because you're not loving every album, sometimes fans get mad at you, but then the next one you're like, oh, that's actually a really good one, and then so you feel whiplash with the rest of the fan base. And then those ones there, it's like, I guess the most epitomized of this is Maiden, where it's like, every time a new Maiden out, everyone's like, oh, this is the best of new Maiden. Oh, now this one is the best of the new Maiden. It's like, what is it? Like, did it ever drop in quality?
Yeah.
And being that fan where you can go, if what I pull up is the classic run, which usually for a lot of bands is anywhere from 4 to maybe at best 8 albums. And then, maybe pull up the other ones when it's not the year it came out. It's not the tour cycle, but so I think this is part of a discussion of like, how does one deal with being a fan or a former fan of a band who has become an institution? And I think Immolation is very comparable to Darkthrone in that there's certainly differences in that. I think like you mentioned, Immolation's recording process, and Darkthrone I think is a rather different one from that, in some sense.
Well, they basically record live. I remember reading an interview with Nocturnal Culture where he said one of the reasons we don't play live is because we basically record live, and they're meant to be getting the live experience through the record or whatever. Anyway, sorry, Karen.
No, which I think is maybe one quality that like the fans that stick with Darkthrone enjoy with it, that it feels like a bunch of guys going to the pub and recorded a show that no one else got to see. And with Immolation, I think because of the COVID gap, like when Acts of God came out, I really enjoyed that album, but I will say probably since 2023, or maybe at least since 2024, I haven't listened to it that much. And Descent, when it came out, I haven't really felt. I think I gave it one full listen, and I really haven't gone back to it since. Even Atonement, I didn't remember as that good of a one. Although I remember seeing them on that tour, and I have friends who keep on telling me that's one of their better last albums. But in general, I think I kind of agree with Majesty and Decay onward. It's kind of just been kind of hit or miss. But even before that, like Shadows in the Light, I don't think that album left much of a mark. And nothing they really do is probably going to change the fact that, like, if I'm thinking of peak Immolation, I'm probably thinking of Dawn Possession up through Unholy Cult. Like, if I want classic Immolation, it's probably going to be those. And if, go to my grave with one album, it's probably going to be Close to World Below or Unholy Cult. So
yeah, I don't think many Immolation. Well, I have read Immolation fans that would disagree with that and pick the post 2010 albums, but I think most Immolation fans worth their salt would generally agree with that assessment. But I was emphasizing how much I love them because I do give them the time of day every time they release an album. But I think in a more general sense, when you were talking about like when bands become institutions, I was mentally going through my CD collection and thinking there are very few bands that I do own over 10 albums of who are still releasing albums to that extent. So like you've got your Burzums and your Bathories who will never do anything again, and I've got basically all of their recorded material that I could get hold of. Immolation, I have everything up to Acts of God, and Descent will probably be the first album that I don't bother buying, because until that point I was an Immolation completist. I was like, I do need to own everything, and even if they start releasing crap I might still buy it because I feel that affinity towards them. But now this one I'm just like, actually, what's the point? I could spend my money on something else. And it got into, when you were talking about bands like Iron Maiden and stuff, even more of an institution. There are fans of music. There are fans of particular genres of music, and then there are fans of bands. You can be both, don't get me wrong, but I think there are some people that will just buy everything, buy a certain band, because they've just invested so much of their life into it. Whereas there are bands and artists that I do very much revere, but I'm talking specifically about sort of record collection curation here, like creating my CD collection. It needs to be a broader overview of the genres that I like, rather than a completist kind of collection of a particular band. And I think as well, when bands go on for releasing albums consistently over the years, every 2 or 3 years, say, I just don't know if it's possible to do that in one style to a certain bar of quality, unless they shift around styles a little bit, move things around.
No, I mean,
yeah.
I often say, like, especially when looking at bands from the 80s and onward, and and I'm one of the biggest when it comes to a band's classic era. Like, Metallica is always going to be one of my all-time favorites, but I'm also very much willing to admit, after about 4, if we're pushing it, 5 albums, I don't know how much you really need anything more. And then, and even with Maiden, like, in Priest, like, I feel like a truly great band, truly great, like, it does not matter how much shit they shovel out afterward, but a truly great band, if they have anywhere from 5 to 7 to, God forbid, 8 albums that are legitimately really good, that's extremely impressive and extremely rare. Like, I think the average band maybe puts out 2, maybe 3 good albums, and then and then the greats, the truly greats, get anywhere from 5 to up. But the idea that a band could have 20 great albums, I think, is a fantasy. And I think, and even a band like Darkthrone, to me, like, to that point, like, it's a debate I don't even care to necessarily have. Like, I have my own personal ranking, but it's not something I'm willing to argue about. Whereas, like, I could say with Maiden, it's like, well, the first 7 albums, like, they're all fucking 10 out of 10, fucking fantastic. And because of that, they have that leeway to do whatever the fuck they want. And I might not care, but, then we're like, oh, hey, we're doing a tour, we're going to play some old stuff, or, hey, we've never played Alexander the Great. It's like, okay, I want to go see that. So I think I just have a mindset in me where it's like, if a band hits that, they got at least 5 solid albums, they will at least always endear me to hear something, to see if maybe another good song has come out, and who knows, maybe another great album. But that already puts them in pretty a high echelon of bands for me, because most, I assume, won't get past 3 really good albums.
Yeah, and I'll wrap up with this, but it does also kind of, I agree, but it does also kind of suck on a personal level, because I have a sort of parasocial relationship with the guys from Immolation. Like, I've read a lot of interviews from them. I've read that book. I've met them a couple of times at gigs. I've exchanged a couple of words, but, like, they seem like really nice, down-to-earth guys. And I kind of, because they've made music that is so important to me, it's like, well, I kind of want the best for them. And they've just got to the stage where they're able to live off their work. Basically, they're signed to a bigger label, Nuclear Blast. They're starting to get recognized. They were always a bit underrated compared to, your Morbid Angels and Cannibal Corpses and so on, and they deserve that success. But it's also come at the price of me just not, that music leaving me a little bit cold. And you could call that literally selling out, but it's also, I'm not saying that bitterly. I do genuinely kind of want them to do well off their work, but it's also, they seem to be succumbing to that law of, you can't have more than 7 or 8 good albums. It's kind of, unless you're shifting styles or you're kind of a once in a generation talent, it's just not possible. But that also means that there is a shelf life for any kind of career, unless you break up and reform with different members and do a completely different band or something. There is always going to be that sort of hard stop on how far you can take it, I suppose. And the truly great bands have had that kind of bumpy kind of career. I'm thinking, Morbid Angel, in that they did have a run of really good albums, but a kind of bumpy road since then. But they're still up there in kind of the pecking order of death metal bands, and a few others like that. So yeah, it's sort of, I don't know, it's swings and roundabouts. I wanted to end on a more profound saying, but it's just gone and it's late. So
yeah. Well, again, I think I think there's enough material in that, and adding a few other voices. We should definitely dive back into that. But yeah, I think Darkthrone and Immolation are two great bands who may not have, the point of doing anything new might be gone, but we'll see.
We'll see, yeah. And there's a few others coming up this year that I am very interested to listen to. One being the new Nagaroth album, talking about bumpy careers. So yeah, I'm going to listen to that one soon. But yeah, I hope you very much have enjoyed this discussion. Check out the bands that we've discussed. I know we preferred some to others, but they're all worth checking out in their own right. And do check out Immolation and Darkthrone if you haven't heard of those bands before. Sorry, it's late here. Whatever. Thanks very much, Joseph. It's been a great discussion.
Pleasure as always, Shirley.
And thank you very much for listening, and enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.